In Canada, we have a unique aspect to our social justice warrior activism that is quite different from the United States. There is a widely held belief among many activist groups that Canada doesn't actually belong to us, the people that live here, because anyone that's not of First Nations heritage is deemed a settler, and there is a growing movement of activists who want to see Canada, quote, decolonized. Now that can mean slightly different things depending on the activists or the group they belong to, but essentially it means that Canadians of European heritage need to go back to Europe, and I assume the same with Canadians of Asian or African heritage being asked to return to their ancestral homeland as well. And I'm not kidding, at almost every anti-development protest I attend, I see signs and banners with calls to decolonize Canada. The crazy part is, many of the people who take this position aren't even First Nations. They are simply suffering from the world's largest case of white liberal guilt. There are certainly radical First Nations resistance activists too that push this narrative. But what we often see from the regressive left nowadays is the main source of this crazy activism comes from academics. And the latest example in British Columbia is no different. Take archaeologist Joanne Hammond. She wants to have a series of information plaques scattered along British Columbia's highways decolonized. Take a look at some of the plaques. They're really nice and they provide insight to any tourists or locals who want to understand more about some of the rural parts of BC and its history before and after joining Confederation. There is nothing racist on any of the plaques, but that's not good enough for Hammond because she thinks they deliberately exclude Indigenous stories and portray the colonial era as something that led to prosperity. Well, first of all, the last part of that statement is true. The colonialism of Canada did lead us to modern economic prosperity, and it's a prosperity that First Nations today can and do benefit from. So Hammond decided to redo the plaques in Photoshop to read differently, changing the stories to what she believes was a more accurate and fair representation, focusing on First Nations. But here's the irony. Hammond herself is not First Nations, and has said that most of the information she used to rewrite the plaques came from First Nations testimonies. And that's where the big problem starts. First Nations history is Canadian history. I will never deny that, but it is rarely recorded and written down. Instead, it is traditional to keep and pass history on from generation to generation by telling stories, not documenting it. This means it is difficult to be accurate and stories change or are modified as they are passed down. So how on earth can Hammond be 100% sure her rewrites are even accurate? Well, she can't. She's simply virtue signaling for attention because she's a social justice warrior that thinks we need to decolonize Canada and decolonize Canadian history, whatever the heck that means. Now, some of you may know this, but before I joined Rebel Media, I worked in education. And in BC, our humanities classes, called social studies, in grade 8 and 9, are almost exclusively about Canadian history with a focus on First Nations and the impact colonialism had on First Nations communities. It goes over the horrors of the diseases we brought unintentionally to the shores of North America and the inhumane and brutal practices of residential schools. There is no student in BC who comes out of high school who does not understand the negative and terrible actions of our colonial past. So knowing all that, my question for people like Hammond and those who wish to decolonize Canada is simple. Why are you asking people who were born here or who moved here from every inch of the globe for a better life to pay for the sins of people from decades, if not centuries, before us? For the Rebel.media, I'm Christopher Wilson. We talk a lot about social justice warrior activism on this channel, so hit subscribe on our YouTube channel so you never miss an update. And if you really like what we're doing, well, for just $8 a month, you can get premium content that you just won't find anywhere else.